with Zechariah. God, we give you thanks again for your word and your prophets. Lord, we ask you to give us the wisdom to understand the words and how it affects and changes our life here and now. Amen. All right, so Zechariah is really in two distinct parts. I mean, there's a stark division, chapters 1 through 8 and then 9 through 14. Matter of fact, many very reputable, reliable scholars believe that this is two different authors, and it's actually two different works, and they just kind of attributed it to one person, Zechariah. Most modern scholars actually divide it into 1st Zechariah and 2nd Zechariah, which I didn't know before I started my research here. But then once you get into the material, you really do see this real contrast. But there's a lot of things like that. So Paul probably wrote 3 letters to the Corinthians, and the 2 that we includes the 2 are kind of amalgamations of the 3, and different things like that. So just not that it diminishes the authority or the reliability of the text, just an interesting thing. So in 1st Zechariah, we get a series of 8 visions and 2 sermons. It's clearly dated within the reign of King Darius, king of Persia, and Judah is part of the rule that's administered from Babylon. And the politics of the day are there, and they have an influence on the writing, but they're not as driving of a force as they are in some of the other books. In 2nd Zechariah, 9 through 14, we get this broad visionary writing, and clues as to dates, political climate, etc., are really sparse and uncertain. And there's some scholars that actually associate the 2nd Zechariah section more with Malachi than with the 1st Zechariah, and it was canonized right after it. So just again, interesting stuff there. So the superscription in verse 1 of 1st Zechariah identifies Zechariah as the prophet, placing him as a contemporary / colleague of Haggai. And it's Zechariah, son of, I forget the name, and that's son of someone else. So it dates Zechariah, his father, his grandfather, but they're no one overly important. So we start here with verse 2 and 3. It's interesting to me. God talks to the people. The Lord was very angry with your ancestors. Therefore tell the people. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Return to me, declares the Lord Almighty, and I will return to you, says the Lord Almighty. So we see that name Almighty there. Remember the different names for identifying God. God and the biblical authors would use the different names of God at different times to highlight part of who God was, especially speaking to a situation. So when they talk about the Lord Almighty, they are saying someone with the authority to command all of this. So keep going in the verse. God's anger over the sins of God's people, God's call to return, and God's reminder of covenant has become common at this point. So again, when we look back, we see this thing. God's angry because they sinned, and God calls them to return. And that could just about be the theme of like 80% of the Old Testament, I think. Like the people sin, and God says this isn't okay, and something's going to happen, and you can return to me now, or you can wait and let all the bad stuff happen and return to me then. So it's kind of which one do you want to happen? So I'm struck by how frequent it is that this call of God is return, return, return. And again, we look at God's judgment back then and we think, oh my gosh, God was just so harsh and mean. But how many chances do people get? I mean, this is 70 times 7, right? This is this incredible grace and mercy and forgiveness on display, and the consistent call to return and to say, yeah, you've done horrible things, but even still come back to me. So that I'm kind of struck by that even in the Old Testament, I mean, I hate to say it that way, but even in the Old Testament, we're finding this patience of God and this hesitance to punish, and this desire to see life and not death and goodness, etc. So, and God's desire and God's reminder of covenant are always there. God's always, I'll be your God, return to me, and here's what I'll do. And they're further explicated in verses 4 through 7. And then from 1:7 all the way through 6:15, we get Zechariah's 8 visions. And look, so when I was putting this one together, this is one of those books that really could have been a study unto itself, because these visions are so detailed. And there's so much symbolism, there's so much going on, but we just can't get into the details. So I'm just going to do the survey thing of here's the vision, here's a little bit, move on to the next one. This can be something you could really study in depth. But in 1:17, we get the first vision. Zechariah finds himself in the wilderness speaking to a man riding a red horse among myrtle trees and in this big ravine. And behind the man are red, brown, and white horses. The horses speak and give a report to the man, and the man turns out as an angel of the Lord, kind of an intermediary for Zechariah and the people. So every bit of scholarship I saw said the significance of the colors of the horses is actually lost. Like, we don't know why they were in these different colors, but the fact that there are 4 different colors is symbolism that we understand. So numerology, I'll say it the right way. Numbers matter, but we can't get kooky with numerology. For example, I had a person tell me one time you could read the 3rd letter of every other word of this book and it would spell Adolf Hitler. It's like, well, if I got a box of Scrabble tiles out, I'm sure I could spell anything. Or if I looked in War and Peace, I'm sure I could spell anything I want. That's coincidence. That's whatever. However, when numbers are mentioned explicitly in the Old Testament, it really does have a meaning. So 4 symbolizes totality and completeness. So as we look at some numeric significance in the OT, so the number 1 was significant. There's only one God, something that can stand alone on its own, and only God can do that. So that's a big deal. And if you notice in creation, there is a lot of numerology in creation, because the writer of Genesis was contrasting and combating a pagan culture where the deities were part of creation as well. They were created. So the creator needs to stand above, needs to stand beyond all of these. And then you get 2, which is symbolic of union. 2 witnesses had to verify truth, right? It's not good for human to be alone, so God made a partner, and then they were complete. And by the way, I ran across a great quote looking that up that I posted on Facebook from Matthew Henry's commentary in the 1700s about how woman was not made from man's head to rule over him, nor from his feet to be walked upon, but from his side to be equal. And I've been asked before, don't I believe that the man is the spiritual head of the house and the leader of the church? No, I don't. I believe man and woman are equal. And I believe there are some areas where if a man and a woman are married, the husband is stronger and the wife is weaker, and vice versa. And I believe each are there to complement one another. And I don't think you can just go across genders. For example, I know some houses where the man handles all the money because the woman prefers it that way. And I know others where the woman handles the money because the man prefers it that way. And I know still others where they both handle the money, and that's fine. So I am personally not a man as the head person theologically. I believe that in the union between male and female, we then find the complete image of God in companionship because of the Trinity and relationship. And I think that to a degree, there have been some silly gender roles. For example, if my car engine quit working, there ain't a thing I can do about it. I don't know anything about it. But if you said, Chris, I need you to cook me up this or that, I can do it. I can go and get in the spice cabinet. I know what goes with what, and I can figure it out. Well, in the 1950s, that wouldn't work, right? Because the man was supposed to do this. And you know, I don't think God has any preference whether men or women cook or work on cars or whatever. I think individuals play to their strengths and what they're good at. My dad's a chef. He's not great at building things, but he's a fantastic chef. So, and I'm saying all that with the union thing, to say that my theology is that man and woman are equal in the eyes of God, therefore equal spiritually, which is another reason why I'm in a denomination that supports women in ministry. And I'm going to preach a sermon on that. I think the general congregation needs to hear from the pulpit why we believe all this and etc. So, anyways, that's just a rabbit trail. So we get to the number 3, the number of the Trinity, which is implicit, right? It's not explicit, but it's implicit in there. As the first number of completeness, if you look in the Old Testament, it's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right? There's always that 3. Whenever God does something in 3, that's significant. That's a proof that it's God doing it, and that's, it's 2 or more witnesses, but when it's 3, it's really more significant. And then 4, the number of completion, it's in regards to creation. So on the 4th day of creation week, quote unquote, God completed the material universe, the sun, moon, stars. So it's saying that the 4th day is very important. There are 4 seasons, and in the Hebrew Old Testament, the word for seasons is actually appointed times. And the seasons are set, and we see that in nature, right? I mean, it happens. Now, the running joke is that in Louisiana there's 2 seasons, but it's hot and cold. But there are seasons. Seasons enough. Interestingly, there's 4 rivers in the Garden of Eden that are mentioned there. And then Eve is mentioned 4 times by name in the scriptures, which, coincidence, maybe. Again, you can get too wonky with this stuff, but there's definitely some significance to 4. So it mattered. And we could keep going with significance of other numbers, and I listed out some of the numbers that are biblically significant. Just when God mentions numbers, it's done for a reason, and it's done as a sign that yes, God is doing this. That it's not a coincidence. For example, you look at the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, how many disciples did Jesus have? 12. So there's a lot to that. But the main point of the first vision is that Yahweh, God, it doesn't really matter, but the pronunciation of God's name from Hebrew into English as Jehovah is actually an incorrect translation. Yahweh is a much more accurate of the letters, the way the Hebrew works in the vowels and etc. But so, I mean, there are old songs, Jehovah Jireh, my provider. It's not wrong, it's just not accurate, which doesn't hurt anything to say it. But Yahweh is really the most correct translation. And in the part of the reason was because in the Jewish text in the Hebrew, they actually wouldn't write out the name of God. So that's where all that comes from. So Yahweh is going to return to Jerusalem. And that's why you'll always hear me say Yahweh and never Jehovah, because it's just more correct, more scholarly, accurate. Okay, so 1:18 through 21, we get the second vision, 4 horns and 4 smiths. See the numbers. 2:1 through 5, the third vision, Jerusalem is a city without walls, too large to measure. It's really interesting. The vision Zechariah gets here is this guy gets out basically a measuring tape, and he's just walking around with it. And Zechariah is like, what are you doing? It's like, measuring Jerusalem. And it's just, there's no walls. So it goes on forever, which is symbolic of God's kingdom, right? Because Jerusalem was where God was, and God is saying the whole earth will be Jerusalem, which, as we see later in the New Testament, is the way that it's looked at. So then in 3:1 through 10, we get the fourth vision. Joshua, who's the high priest at the time, not Joshua from way back, just this is a different Joshua. There's the Joshua, an angel of the Lord, and the Satan, which literally means accuser. So in many English translations, Satan is translated as a proper noun, as a name, a capital S. But really, like here in the Hebrew, it includes a definite article. It's not Satan as a name. It's the Satan or the Satan, depending on how you pronounce it. And that it's actually a title, and the title is the accuser. And anytime you see the word Satan, the being that is functioning in that role is always accusing God's people. That's what they do. So when you read the book of Job and the Satan enters the throne room, he's accusing, and he came to Jesus to tempt, and he didn't have anything to accuse him of. But so this is one of those biblical debates and discussions about whether or not Satan is one sentient being or a force or multiple beings, etc. And you can get way off into all that stuff. I generally don't fool with it, because here's what I know. I know the one who gives life and who is resurrected, and the rest honestly isn't as big of a deal, right? And most people get their theology about the devil and about hell from Dante and from Bugs Bunny cartoons rather than the scriptures. I mean, folks get their theology from all sorts of places, and it's not really scriptural. You know, the horns and the pit, none of that's in there. There is some vague stuff about Lucifer being cast out of heaven by God, or by God through Michael, and etc. And again, I just don't have any interest to really go there and worry about it too much. I don't fool with it. So, just another interesting tidbit there. Okay, so 4:1 through 4, we get the fifth vision, a golden lampstand in Zerubbabel. 5:1 through 4, the sixth vision, a flying scroll. And this is why I said that this book could be a study all on its own, because each of the visions, 5:5 through 11, we get the seventh vision, the ephah, this instrument of worship. 6:1 through 8, the eighth and final vision, the four spirits, quote, winds of heaven. And so interesting, the Hebrew word for spirit can loosely be translated as wind as well. So, and you get the four spirits of the winds of heaven are chariots pulled by different colored horses, and again, it's four different colors. So we're seeing this consistent numbering of four here, indicating completeness. All right, chapters 7 through 8 give us a long sermon on fasting and celebration, and it concludes with God's promise to bless Israel, which is, again, one of the most common themes here, and it culminates in the purpose for this blessing. I found this interesting. This is what the Lord Almighty says. In those days, 10 people from all languages and nations will take firm hold of one Jew by the hem of his robe and say, "Let us go with you, because we have heard that God is with you." You know, I just wonder more and more as I read the Old Testament, especially the law, I'm wondering how much of it is not God just saying, you better do this, this, and this, and how much of it is God crafting the people Israel to stand out from the rest of the world, so that God stands out among all the pantheon of gods of the ancient world. And so get this, the Jews, the Israelites, they stand out from the world, and Jesus stands out from among them singularly. So when people say, well, how do you know that Jesus is the only? Well, he was the most unique from the most unique people ever. So I see in the Old Testament God making Israel different for this sole purpose, for people to look and say, God is with you. I believe that. And when I was teaching the confirmation kids the other night, this is great that Christianity is not a new religion. It's the fulfillment of the Jewish religion. We are a part of that branch. Now from there you get into those discussions about whether or not the Jews will be saved, because there seems to be some implications in the New Testament that all of Israel will be reconciled and redeemed back to God, etc. So it's very interesting stuff. How does that happen? I'm not sure, but there is a discussion on it in the Across the Spectrum book. There's a chapter about that, so if that's something you want to hear about, we can look more into that. But I just see this more and more. God is the author of life, and if people don't come to God, they can't have life, because apart from the author of life, there is no life. But there's so many other gods out there to pull people away that God says, okay, you need to understand that I'm different. And then God's people are different. And we do see in the Old Testament peoples that the Israelites went to war with, a lot of times they realized that they were different. Even if they still fought them, they knew what they were doing. They knew they were fighting God. Okay, so 2nd Zechariah, chapters 9 through 14. 9, 1 through 17 promises the restoration of Zion, in which Yahweh is again portrayed as an unstoppable warrior fighting on behalf of his people. And again, we get difficulty with these warrior these warrior metaphors for God, because it's commonly thought that Jesus was a pacifist. It's commonly thought that Jesus was a no violence at any time person. And for people who think that, they see a contrast between God in the New Testament and God in the Old Testament. So I wanted to get your thoughts on Jesus being or not being a pacifist.
Grace.
Okay?
Law. It couldn't, the Old Testament, it was structured, the law was absolute. That's all they had. And the Lord would get sick and tired of them, and then he would do away with them. And Jesus came preaching the gospel of the teachings of love and forgiveness and love everyone and all these things, which we receive it as grace. When we failed, and we have forgiveness, and he doesn't want to destroy, or it's a love that we understand, but we don't know the full depth of it. That would be the two differences that I would see.
And that makes me think of something, though. In the Old Testament, God gave the Israelites the commands to look different. So if they violated that, there was too much at stake for God to let that continue, because it would lead other people astray. So God would get rid of them. Like, Achan, the guy from the Israelite camp who stole the stuff and buried it under his tent, well, him and his family got stoned to death for that. And we read it and we're like, oh my goodness, that's just horrible. But it was such a serious matter, God couldn't allow that because it would lead people down the wrong path. But now fast forward to Paul's writings, which the church doesn't like to teach on this. In the Corinthian church, there was a young man who was engaged in an intimate relationship with his stepmother. And the church was saying, look how much grace we have. We can do anything and we're forgiven. And Paul says, no, you got to kick that joker out. Because, and Paul writes this, even the unbelievers in Corinth are looking at y'all saying, whoa, we don't even do that. And they were way out there. So again, God's name could not afford to be tarnished in that way. And they put the guy out. But if you read later in 2 Corinthians, that putting him out actually brings him to his senses, and he returns and says, you know what, that was wrong. So if someone wanted to enact church discipline like that today, I think people would just cry foul and, throw the first stone. But I think there's a difference in throwing a stone and correcting a sister or brother who is in sin. I think there's a big difference, right? But what do y'all think about the assertion that Jesus was a pacifist? Do you think that's true or not? Was Jesus anti-violence? Anti-violence.
He went into the temple and destroyed the money changer tables, and you get the thought of a movie, and he goes in and throws all the stuff up against the wall and shatters it. I don't have any idea, but he got rid of them in a means that they understood.
He made a whip and hit them with it. I know that. I mean, he said he
pretty-
fashioned a whip and drove them out with it. So that's, I mean, he had to be physically hitting them with the whip, or if he wasn't physically hitting them, coming close enough that they believed it was going to happen. So they got out of the way.
Right.
There's in the garden, he told, if I remember this right, y'all correct me, he told Peter to put his sword away. But then after that, didn't he instruct them to go 2 by 2 and take their sword with them? Is that?
Yeah, and there's interesting scholarship on that passage. Some people say, well, yeah, Jesus was telling them to arm up and be ready to fight for your life. There were other people saying that he was speaking in metaphor and hyperbole because he was just telling them, showing them what the dangers of their life was going to be like. And some who say that he was not instructing them to actually prepare for violence, they're comparing those words, that very isolated text, to the totality of Jesus' ministry, where he would tell them, don't fight back, don't do this, just, however. I always find it interesting to have that discussion about whether or not Jesus was a pacifist, because in some instances I think he was. In other instances, I think he wasn't.
But I don't think he ever did anything in a way that would have made it look like Jesus was like somebody who lashed out at people, because that wouldn't have worked for what he was doing. Like, he was coming to show love and grace and mercy to people, and yet, like, he did go into the temple and drive them out with a whip. But that needed to happen. That was his way of showing people, like, this is horribly wrong.
Because they were taking advantage of other people.
Right.
And that's when Jesus got wrapped around the axle, so they say, was when other people were being taken advantage of. So he never once used a violent measure to defend himself or even his disciples.
Right. So I think, I don't know if I would say he was like a complete pacifist, but his mission was not to show how strong he was, or like,
I agree with that.
use his notoriety as a way of like getting people to fall in line. It was more about like, I'm living the way you should try to live. And so he couldn't just go out and be like, oh, you're doing wrong, like beat people up or anything, So I think it was more to show us that violence is not the only answer. Yes, sometimes you have to take action when something is seriously wrong. But I also think there are so many people who are quick to go straight for violence when we should be trying every other avenue other than violence.
So see, and the reason I think this discussion matters, and if I'm hearing you right, you're going deeper than the action. You're going to the motives and the desired outcome.
Right.
Which is a very Jesus-like thing to do, right? Move beyond the action and move to the internal motivation.
But the people knew that this was wrong the way, and they knew it was a setup because of the way they were changing money and how they were selling sacrificial animals. It was
a racket.
It was a racket.
Well, so I think the question, is Jesus a pacifist? My opinion, I think that affects how a person of faith, a disciple of Jesus, engages the debate surrounding gun control. I really do. I think, I don't think I should take my politics to the scriptures. I think I should read the scriptures and let them guide my politics. Because politics, people say, well, keep politics and faith separate. Well, no, because faith governs my worldview, right? Faith in Christ. And my worldview, part of that is how we live together in society. I mean, Jesus said this relationship is equal to this one. So how we live together is important. And when we're talking about whether or not lives can or should or can't or wouldn't be taken or however that takes shape, I think that's a discussion people of faith should have from the perspective of faith in Jesus. And I hear some friends who I respect, but who are very much on one side, who have said and have posted pictures saying things like Jesus would have owned a gun. And they're not joking. They really believe that. They believe Jesus would be a staunch gun owner, and that we as Christians should have the right to own guns and use them, etc. And then you got people on the other side saying Jesus would absolutely be against it. He would say it's horrible and it's wrong. So both sides, both extremes, are using teachings from the one that I claim to pattern my life after. So I think it's an important question to wrestle with. And I'm a good Methodist because I'm kind of right in the middle. Yeah.
Well, I think your sermon this morning pointed to turn on the light. That there are many things in our society today that are not biblical.
Hmm?
They are not anything that Jesus taught.
Mm-hmm.
That in fact there are 180 degrees in the opposite direction.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point in our life, just like in Jesus' life, you've got to say, this is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And we've left it up to a lot of people to do the talking for us who haven't done the talking for us.
I agree, and I also think as the church we have picked and chosen which evils about which we will get outraged. I think if a person theologically doesn't believe a man and a man or a woman should stand at an altar and be married, I'm okay with that theological position, but I want to see the same level of outrage over 9-year-old girls being sold into the sex industry as there is about this. And they'll say, of course I'm outraged. Well, what are you doing to stop it? I think we should put as much effort into stopping these other atrocities.
Or the starving kids in wherever.
Exactly. So I think the tendency is to hijack the teachings of Jesus, and both sides do it in my opinion. Hijack the teachings of Jesus to prop up a political platform, rather than humbly saying, Lord, where would you have me go? So I wrestle with it, and if you had to ask me today, should a Christian own an AR-15? Some people would say yes, some people would say no. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, I will say this, I love our country. It's the best one in the world, but the Constitution is not the Holy Bible, in my opinion. Now, the Constitution is important, and men and women fight and die to protect it, and it is a supremely important thing in our life together. But to me, if the Constitution ever conflicts with the Scriptures are going to win out. And that's that's the way I see it. But I would never tell anyone they have to see it one way or the other. But then, you veer into the whole, what does the Second Amendment actually mean? And that's another big so. Anyways, and I find it weird. I've had more political discussions during this minor prophet study than I ever have in anything else. But these minor prophets were writing very politically. I mean, they addressed political things, and they talked about the corruption in politics and the ways of governing life together. So, and I just appreciate a place where I can say, hey, I kind of think this, and what do y'all think? And I think there's room for everybody. I just don't like to see the teachings of Jesus get taken to an extreme that they may not have been meant for on either direction.
Well, I really like the way that you said we should be letting the Bible, show us like our political views instead of letting our political views show us how we view the Bible. Like, because that really does make sense. And I like
Well, that's what the Pharisees did, right?
Yeah.
They took the scriptures and they said, well, see, it says this, this, and this, so we can do this, this, and this. And Jesus said, no, you kind of missed the true meaning of it, right? So, and look, I'm going to stand here and tell you that I've gotten it wrong before, and probably will get it wrong again, but I'm doing my best. And if you ever see me kind of veering off, say, hey, I think you're kind of missing the point there. I think Jesus really kind of wants to do this, and because I need to hear it too. Because we don't have pastoral infallibility in the Methodist Church. I love our Catholic sisters and brothers. They're fantastic. Seriously, fantastic denomination. Okay, back to the actual discussion. Okay, 10, 1 through 12 speak of Judah and Israel's restoration, again with the downfall of their enemies. That's another politically charged one, because there are those who have taken scriptures like that and again use them to fuel colonialism and manifest destiny. And the enemies of this people obviously are the enemies of God, but there are times when we are the enemy of God because we are doing things that are wrong. So 11, 1 through 3 speak of a metaphorical ecological disaster. He talks about trees being destroyed and coming down all through the forest. And the trees represent figures of power and pride being brought down. And I thought that was a great metaphor, like these big mighty trees that we think could never be brought down, and yet a fire, a flood, a storm can bring them down. So the message I was getting from that is no matter how big and strong the power seems, God has a way of cutting it down, and that happens. 11, 4 through 17 give us a poem about a shepherd and his flock, the different staffs he uses, the slaughter of the sheep, etc. And now this one, 11, 4 through 17, through multiple scholars is regarded as one of the most difficult texts in the Old Testament. There's layer upon layer there that is deep and metaphorical, and some of the metaphors, they really have a hard time pinning down what they're talking about. And it's just kind of a difficult one. Okay, 12, 1 through 8 predicts a war against Jerusalem that will involve multiple nations. And then 12, 9 through 13, 1 predicts victory and mourning as a result of the war. Then on 13, 2 through 6, here's what we see. On that day I will banish the names of the idols from the land, and they will be remembered no more, declares the Lord Almighty. I will remove both the prophets and the spirit of impurity from the land, those who are prophesying falsely. So check this out. And if anyone still prophesies, their father and mother to whom they were born will say to them, you must die because you've told lies in the Lord's name. Then their own parents will stab the one who prophesies. So once again, saw a joke. Children, instead of playing violent video games, are told to go to their room and read the Old Testament. On that day, every prophet will be ashamed of their prophetic vision. They will not put on a prophet's garment of hair in order to deceive. Each will say, I am not a prophet, I am a farmer. The land has been my livelihood since my youth. If someone asks, what are these wounds on your body? They will answer, the wounds I was given at the house of my friends. So this is talking about prophets, not only who prophesy falsely. It's not just all prophets. These are ones who prophesy falsely. And a lot of people would come and say, well, there's been a word from God. And that word from God very strangely would benefit that person. And it would call those other people to benefit the person. Again, I'm reminded of the slick-haired, snake-faced televangelist preying on poor old ladies who have hardly any money and telling them that they send their money into his ministry because God told them to. It's in my position, it's hard for me to not rail against that, because that's wrong on so many fundamental levels. And let's just say I, a long time ago, vowed to never be that kind of pastor. And if you ever see me sliding that way, slap me and tell me to stop. Because
wake up.
Yeah, I got nothing good about that, nothing good to say about folks who use God's name. And again, that's what the commandment in the Ten Commandments is about. It's not about saying GD this or GD that. It's about using God's name for an inappropriate means for gaining power, wealth, privilege, control. And again, to go back to politics, both platforms in a presidential election will invoke the name of God as supporting their platform. That, well, this is God's, this is, of course, if you're a Republican, of course you vote for God. Or if you're a Democrat, of course you side with the teachings of Jesus. Well, maybe there are folks on both sides who side with both, and maybe there are folks who get it wrong on both sides. But it's pretty clear here what God thinks of people who use God's name and abuse it for power and privilege. And I think this passage should be stood up and read at every seminary and Bible college in the country, right? Said, look, don't you get out there and use your position and use God's authority that He's given you to manipulate and for personal gain, because that's not a cool deal. Now, I don't know that their parents have actually stabbed them. I hope not, but this is pretty graphic stuff. So, yeah, and I don't want to hear that the Bible's boring either. Doggone. Okay, so 13, 7 through 9, we get a familiar text regarding a shepherd who is struck. I'll strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. That was quoted in Matthew 26 and in Mark. Remember, Jesus says this is going to happen. And chapter 14 closes the book. And again, so in verse 13, or chapter 13 rather, this is one of those that sometimes can be utilized as God saying this will happen and that God wants this to happen, but it's not God doing the striking. It's God saying that this is what's going to happen. There's this really subtle difference in all the Hebrew writings about what God is going to allow and what God is causing. And it's just that's a tricky line. We've kind of wrestled with it before in these writings, but just a tricky line. So, chapter 14 closes the book. Chapter 14, we get 1 through 11, which is a war and transformation, and 12 through 21, the nations coming to Jerusalem. So again, earlier we had Jerusalem without walls, right, without boundaries, and without walls signifies that there's nothing to keep people out of the kingdom of God. So again, just one other political one. I've heard the walls used in both ways. I've heard people say, well, Nehemiah built a wall, therefore it's God's will for America to build a wall and keep people out, so we should support our president's wall initiative. But I've heard other people say that the scriptures talk about tearing down walls and having open borders and boundaries, so it's a violation of scripture to build a wall. So see, again, you get both sides grabbing the scripture and saying, see, you're supposed to do this, or no, you can't do that. So again, and I'm watching the commercials for the gubernatorial election, and they can't both be right, can they? Because they're saying exact opposite things, so I'm just confused right now. Okay, so that closes Zechariah. The nations are going to come to Jerusalem, and the end of that says to me that God says, one day it is going to be God's kingdom throughout the earth. And what a great day. And what a great fact that consistently throughout the scriptures, the kingdom of God is open and accessible to all nations, races. Nowhere in the scriptures is God's kingdom relegated to one people group, one culture, one language, one race. It's a fantastic thing. And if you've never been to another country, if you've never attended a worship service that is in a language that you don't understand, you've missed out, because that is one of the closest points to heaven you're ever going to get. I've been on a couple of foreign mission trips, and one of them I didn't understand a word they were saying, but I understood the worship on a level that was just so much deeper than language. I know that sounds kind of weird and spiritually touchy-feely, but man, it was just a powerful thing. It's such a great thing when I see that, I'm reminded, this is not just an American English thing. This is an everybody of all time thing. So, I'm not going to give my summary. What are your concluding thoughts on Zechariah? And I want to hear them.
Well, I liked some of the scripture readings about the birth of Jesus Christ, as well as the second coming of Jesus Christ in the book. And I, like you, I appreciate going to another country and attending worship service there. Fortunate enough to go on an accreditation students visit to Mexico, and a little town in central northern part, central part of Mexico. Traditional square, people coming and going. But what was so interesting about it was when we landed at the airport, it was like we were getting into a foreign country with the tin barriers all up, and you had to go in, and there were these military people with their shotguns, not shotguns, like the AK-47, and I mean, it was all serious business there. I mean, you didn't know what was going to happen with all this military people there. Unfortunately, our person that we were coordinating the visit with was not far away to help us get through there and to kind of talk to the people, which I know some Spanish, but not enough to be fluent in any regard. But when Sunday came and we went to the Catholic Mass, of course, most of the people there are Catholic. And it was just a beautiful service, and people were so friendly. Just it was a good experience to do that.
So you mentioned the readings about the birth of Christ, the return of Christ in the Old Testament. I'm always excited when I see one of those connections. I remember one summer I took a group of students to a youth camp organization called Student Life, and the preacher for the week would always tell us student leaders, here's what we're going to do this week. You know, preach this. And this guy, and Student Life is interdenominational. It's multiple denominations. So he says to us the first day when we're there, the kids are all in one room and all the youth leaders in another room. He says, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take them through the 7 feasts of the Old Testament and explain to them how Jesus connects to each one and what his role is. And I'm thinking, it's going to be the worst week of camp ever. These kids ain't going to get this. They loved it. They absorbed and he did a fantastic job. He really, every single feast they were commanded to have, Jesus, it like foretold him, and he fulfilled a certain aspect of what the feast was doing. It was fascinating. Really, really neat stuff. So, yeah, I love it when the two connect, and they connect so much. Any other thoughts on Zechariah?
I like the ending.
Yeah, everybody's got caricatures. I mean, it is one of those that ends fairly well. You know, I thought Zechariah, even though its imagery was difficult at times, was more positive than some of the other books. You know, there's some of the minor prophets where it's just God is angry and this is going to go very poorly for all of you. Those aren't very encouraging at times. Okay, and hopefully I stayed neutral on my political rantings. If not, send a link from the YouTube to the bishop and just make a complaint. That's fine. I'll give you the district superintendent's email. Okay, next week is Malachi, if you'll be here, and then take a break. We'll pick it back up in the spring.